Hello and welcome everybody to today's webinar on the topic of the board candidates checklist. It's a favorite topic of mine. It covers asking the right questions before saying yes to the seat. So many of us view board directorship as being invited to the table possibly, and in many cases giving a yes to that without really going through a process of counter vetting, as we call it, to make sure that position is going to be right, to make sure the board is a right fit for you. I'd like to go through with you all today the topics on how to look at this and how to think about the two-way street of making this decision before you say yes to an offered board seat. All right, I'm your host and speaker today. My name is Mark Pfister. I'm the CEO and Chief Board Consultant of MA Pfister Strategy Group. I'm known for focusing in governance and strategy. I'm a non-executive director, as mentioned, a Chief Board Consultant. I pride myself on having worked with countless public, private, and nonprofit boards, and again, with focus in strategy, governance, and also technology and cybersecurity. I've come to have the nickname of the board architect. I kind of like it. I didn't come up with it, but I do enjoy it. And my book, I welcome you to read this if you're interested in the topic of board architecture, which I believe is the foundational aspects of effective and efficient boards. I welcome you to read this book as well. We'll touch on a few topics today and throughout today's webinar, where we'll come back to this topic of board architecture. We'll speak briefly about it, but if you are interested in more information on it, I welcome you to pick up the book. And also, I've worked with hundreds of board candidates in their proper board packaging. Now, when you're talking about a board candidate packaging themselves properly, it also has aspects, or it includes aspects of how do you prepare and how do you present yourself in a board interview. And many of the topics we talk about, or we're going to talk about shortly, are truly in this space of how are you representing yourself, and not just getting the answers that you want to understand if this board is going to be a perfect or great fit for you, but also to convey some of your knowledge and create this two-way street of discussion that shows your prowess and your knowledge areas of board directorship. So my pleasure to get into that with you today. Few frequently asked questions. I like to start all of my webinars with this. Today's purpose is to share knowledge and trending on successful elements of a board candidate, your evaluation, to ensure the joining of successful boards. If you have questions, please write your questions in the Q&A section. If time allows, which it frequently and always does, I will answer these questions at the close of the presentation. If for some reason we don't have enough time, I will follow up with you via email afterwards. Materials, I always get the question about, will the materials be available to us? Yes, the entire recorded webinar, as well as a link to this particular presentation deck will be available to you. You'll receive an email in the next day or so with a link where you can find this. And additional topic references, something I like to do in our particular webinars is if you do have the desire to drill down further into some of our information areas, you have links on certain pages here within this presentation deck. Again, when you have the link to this presentation deck, you can click on those links to get to other informational articles. Okay. Goals for today also include learning the important board discovery areas of focus for you as a board candidate, and also starting to think about whether you're an aspiring director or an experienced director, what is your plan for an informed appointment decision? Meaning that, again, this two-way street, are you thinking about this and not just waiting for the board to invite you and you say yes, but are you also counter vetting and evaluating that board to make sure it's going to be a great fit? I'll explain shortly how that actually lowers your risk in serving on a board as well. All right, the process for today. I want to go through and talk about a process-oriented approach for this board candidate checklist. And then we're going to get into these, what I view as really the 5 areas that you want to probe and ask questions about and make sure you have answers that meet your satisfaction in the topic areas of values and culture, communication and interaction, strategy and governance, super important, processes and board structure. And then I want to talk a little bit about the compensation and protection areas, and show you how that correlates into the decisioning process, not just on how much you're going to be paid for your service, if indeed it's for a private or a public company, but also understanding how those compensation models can give you a lot of information on how that board operates and if they're keeping current with modern practices in these areas. So that will be our path and the journey I'll bring you on today for our webinar. All right, so let's jump into it. Let's first talk about this process-oriented approach. So starting out, if we look at, as a board candidate, creating a list of questions designed to evaluate if a board is a correct fit for you, and if the board would be successful, it has multiple advantages to include this in your overall process, and we're going to talk about those. So, you know, when you're sitting in the process of an executive or a board search or a placement firm for that matter, and even a nominating committee, you know that they have an evaluation checklist that is extremely detailed, and they reference that frequently throughout the process. They're referencing it before you get there for an interview, and when they go through your board documents and your board bio, they're referencing it during your interviews, or multiple interviews in that process, and they're also referencing it afterwards, after you've had your discussions, as they compare you against other candidates. So I asked the question, why shouldn't you do the same? And when it comes to board candidates going through a vetting process, it's common for these candidates to have certain questions that they want to know answers to, but I think it's much more valuable and shows a lot more of your value in the future serving on that board to have more of a process where you're not just counter vetting, but you're also working this discussion down a path that is beneficial to both parties. So as a board candidate, whether you're aspiring or experienced director, you need to systematically evaluate the board in topic areas that matter most for success. And we're going to talk about those topic areas now in just a moment. So a common observation, my observations across hundreds of board candidates working their way through the board vetting processes, and this is both sitting on either side of the table. So that's working with board candidates to package themselves properly and represent themselves properly and make an impact, a memorable impact, and also sitting on the other side of the table, working and building processes for nominating committees and then helping them with the vetting process. There's something very familiar that I look for, or something I really want to see in this. And this is this balance between defense and offense in terms of how you represent yourself. So most or a majority of board candidates, and this is true of executives also, I find them playing too much defense, meaning that they're simply waiting for a question and then they go into their mode of answering that question. They're not proactively asking questions, number one, that are driving the discussion down a certain path to point out things, not just that they want answers to, but also areas that allow the conversation to be elevated and to build the camaraderie throughout the discussion. So to me, remember that you want to see an experience, and for you to give this experience of balancing not just the answering of questions, but also the asking of extremely valid questions that show that you are also going through a decisioning process from your side, the outside into that board, on whether or not it's going to be a fit for you. So asking tough and valid questions. When a board candidate achieves a balance of defense and offense in their process, the results can truly be amazing. A quick example of this is that I've been through the process of many nominating committees not being so hot early on a particular candidate as they're vetting this candidate or they're in the interview. But as that candidate starts to ask the right questions and starts to build up this story and take the nominating committee on a journey of not just their successes, but also what they're interested in and what they bring to the table, it has totally changed the approach of that nominating committee. And in many cases, those particular directors or candidates have been appointed to those boards. So building that camaraderie and driving that type of two-way discussion is extremely important. So remember this balance of not just answering questions, but also asking valid questions. Again, it comes back to this balance of a flow of the conversation. You're looking to create that connection to show that you are a valid candidate for their particular board and show that you have some depth in the areas of your focus. It's not just this monolithic approach to a question being asked and then you answering that question and then moving on to the next question. That's not the type of dynamic you want to create. You want to create this balance of a two-way street. All right. And these questions, as I'm trying to get across here, it shows that you're thoughtful, inquisitive, and similarly aiming to ensure a great fit with a two-way evaluation and approach. The other side to this that I think is extremely important, by simply balancing this discussion and questioning process, you inherently do what's called establishing your authority and make a lasting impression, because you're commonly asking questions, or you should be asking questions that are not just valid questions for that particular board or that position, but you're showing also your prowess or your knowledge in these spaces. And not to say that you're manipulating your questions or seeding questions to show what you know, but it's showing that these areas are important to you, and it allows you to show that you have knowledge in those particular spaces, even by asking those questions. So for the remainder of today's discussion, in the 5 areas we're going to focus in, remember that we are assuming that you've packaged yourself properly as a modern board candidate and got called for an interview. If you want to know more what exactly that means and what that looks like, I welcome you to read up on some of the information on our particular website on the link here on a program we have that's called Becoming an Exceptional Board Director Candidate. I've also written countless articles on this topic of how to package yourself properly. I think you'll find it useful. That's both for aspiring and experienced directors, by the way, because that packaging component has changed even over the past 5 years and evolved. So values and culture. Let's start with the first area for your checklist. So what exactly does this mean? It's guiding principles that dictate behavior and action of the board, the employees, team members, and even vendors to the organization that have a profound effect on lowering organization and board risk. For those that are my webinar regulars every month, you're probably not surprised by seeing me talk about values and culture first. And I still believe to this day, and will be to the day I die, I think this is the most important concept across any area of leadership, is lived values in an organization and how those form the foundation of your culture. And you can imagine the importance of this in the board space. So again, if we look at this visually, we know that values sits at the top of our chain of focus areas. So values being, what do we stand for? And this forms the foundation for our ethics, principles, and beliefs. And many are surprised to see that this actually sits above the vision and the mission of the organization. To me, you cannot fully reach in a successful way, an effective way, the vision and the mission of an organization without having those values implanted above that in the organization. And the board is responsible for this. Make no mistake, the board owns the values, which is also the culture of the organization. It's not the CEO. The CEO has a portion of ownership of that, but the board is setting the tone and the direction of the values of the organization, which again equals the ethics of the organization. And if we compare all of us, or look at all of us together and start thinking about what questions as a leader do you want to ask? This is for prime questions for an executive position, and definitely important questions and must-haves for a board candidate. So I like to ask questions, or I like to see candidates ask questions of, how does the board actually track the values or the lived values in the organization? So it's not just viewed as a list on a website somewhere that are nice to haves, but they're not really something that's embedded in the organization. You're going to see in a moment when I talk about a decisioning process why this is so important, because every board director should first and foremost be making decisions that are based off the values. The infusion, next topic, is perfect fit for what I said, infusion of values-based decisioning. We'll talk about that in a moment. Commitment to diversity, huge concept right now. I'm glad this has come out. So I've been speaking about this for years. If we truly boil this down, it's about the diversity of perspective leading to diversity of thought, which then in turn leads to positive outcomes or more robust outcomes. Great topic for things we're seeing in today's environment, especially as it correlates to board candidates. Continuing education mindset. There's nothing worse than meeting somebody that thinks they've reached the pinnacle of their career and they're done learning. This is someone to me who's not aware of the principle that the more you learn, the less you know. And it's extremely dangerous for a board or a board member to have this particular belief system. I like the question also next, and you may be surprised by this, but has the board ever removed a director due to breach of values or culture? And this is an interesting question due to the fact that it tells you a few things about that board. One is that board willing to live 100% in the values to protect the culture of the organization, even if there's a board member that's not living up to it? Are they open and willing to make a change? Or are they scared to actually in some way breach that topic and try to remove a board director? It also tells you about the ability of a board to embrace change, right? This is probably one of the hardest areas for a board, a group of directors, to make a decision on, right? It's not an easy process. In many cases, the bylaws are not 100% clear on how to go about removing a director. And there's a lot of legalities that could be encountered in this. But to me, this tells a lot about a board. And even if the answer is no, they never had that scenario, start to probe on the question, are they prepared to do that if indeed somebody breaches those values, or if a director is not in full enforcement or living the culture of the organization. Then I'd like to know also, in terms of this values and the culture area, what actions does the board take to build camaraderie and responsibility on that board? So it's that personal connection to see if the board members are not just there to talk about governance and give their opinions, but are they truly working together? Do they respect one another? What types of actions does the board particularly take to increase that camaraderie and also build that responsibility, or that link of responsibility between the board members and throughout the board as a whole? All of these areas are building this concept of the values of an organization equals the culture, which also for a board and anybody in an organization lowers the organization's risk. It's a great concept to keep in mind of why you're asking these questions, or if a vetting organization, a placement organization, or a nominating committee asks you why these particular questions, you can very clearly answer that you understand values equal culture and also equals a lower organization risk. Now, if we talk a little more about this values-based decisioning under this area of values and culture, this is a very easy diagram. I reference this quite often to show how to go about, as a board leader, how to go about the decisioning or the values-based decisioning process. And there's a few interesting examples that can be applied to this. I write about this in my book as well with Roy Disney and how he applied this. But it's really thinking about everything that crosses your desk or crosses that boardroom table. How do you go about this systematic process of making a decision, and a repeatable process for that matter? And believe it or not, most decisions or things that require decisions that come across your desk, if you do or start the process of initially comparing that against your personal values and the organization's values, and hopefully they're very much linked and the same in most cases, but start to think about this before you get into the technical components of that decisioning. Start to think about, does this fit with the values of the organization if I give a very binary yes or no? Or if I give different layers or levels of decisioning to this, how is this in support of or not in support of the values of our organization? I think you're going to be extremely surprised, as I was years ago, to find out that a large portion of things that come to you for decisioning or come into the boardroom can easily get a yes or no answer as part of the first vetting process by simply asking the question of, is this in support of our values? And then laying it over the vision, the mission, of course, the organization goals, and then drilling down. It's a top-down decisioning process, which should start with your values as a comparison, or the organization's values. And then, of course, some consideration overlays of budget, scope, and time, which for those of you with project management background or certifications, you know that everything has to fall into those three buckets. There's really nothing that falls outside of that. So to incorporate that in your decisioning process is another great way to come to great conclusions. Now, another interesting thing to think about this from a board candidate's viewpoint is, and I'll first say, I'm extremely wary of board candidates, especially in interviews, that either never touch on the topic of values, or they don't include them early enough in the discussion to lay the groundwork that they are a values-based decisioning leader. So I would tell you a quick area of focus here that should come up very early in an interview, or even how you package yourself, is superimposing your personal values either over or with the organization's and the board's values. It shows your alignment very early on, and it shows your understanding of governance, because governance has a huge component of linkage back to the values of the organization, and especially, as I just showed you a moment ago, in your decisioning process. So very important to show this in how you're packaging yourself, and then making sure also, as part of your checklist for the organization that you're either interviewing with or going to be appointed to, are they of a values-based decisioning mindset also? I can tell you it's very frustrating to be part of an organization where you are values-based, but the organization is not. You don't want to be stuck in that scenario. Okay, number two, communication and interaction. How a board communicates and interacts, both internally and externally, directly affects its perception, effectiveness, and its authority. And this is a known fact. We've seen many examples in recent years of boards that have stepped outside of their bounds and maybe done things that have undermined their authority. And it's extremely tough to get back that their positive perception, number one, but also their authority within the organization and external to the organization. So the communication and the interaction is another huge area that you want to drill into to understand if that particular board that you are hopefully going to be a part of is going to be successful, not just for you, but overall for you as a contributor to that board. So some questions to ask or areas to probe when you are a board candidate for any board, to look into their communications and interactions areas. So number one, is there something or a process, is there a software for communication and information sharing? Is there a platform? Many folks will call this a board portal today, which makes the communication very easily flowing. Is there a process for handling urgent matters and escalations? You'd be surprised how many board directors in large global public organizations are tough to get a hold of if it's not scheduled time for a committee meeting or a board meeting, right? So I'm always curious to know what is the process and how is somebody made available when needed on a moment's notice. Very important to make sure the board is fully operational. Documented communications plan. This is both within the board and between the board and the CEO. What is the expectation of communication? How timely is it? How should particular escalations be worked throughout the organization until they reach the board? Or are there areas of the board that should be notified immediately? This to me should be documented. You want to know as a board candidate that you are not going to be put in a risk type scenario and not even understand from a communication standpoint of what's happening because it never reached you. Board book consistency and advanced prep, another greatly important area. How far in advance of a board meeting are you supplied the information for prep for that board meeting? Now, the acceptable for this or the acceptable time frame is commonly 1 week. But I will tell you that many boards, based on the amount of information, many organizations will do this based on the amount of information, that time frame is getting shorter, I'll say, from what I'm seeing. They'll take a day back here and there. It'll be, 5 days instead of 7. Some will interpret that as business days instead of actual days. I will tell you that this tells you a lot about a board and their processes for getting the information where it needs to be in a timely manner. There's nothing worse than a board meeting where nobody had time to prepare or not enough time to prepare. Very frustrating for many board directors. And this is one of the biggest complaints I hear of seated board members, that they want more time for information review. A conflict resolution process. We'll talk in a moment about this, about what do we do or how does a board handle conflicts within the board itself and between the board and other groups or between the board and the CEO. Very important to understand what that resolution process is. And as a board candidate, ask for examples of this if it's been applied before. Communication structure between board committees and between board committees and then also the committees to the board. Another area that's frequently overlooked but extremely important is, remember that the committees of a board, they're the workhorse. That's where the work gets done on the board. You want to make sure there are mechanisms and processes for the proper communication. So you're not just getting updates a week, hopefully a week before a board meeting as you get your board book. But how is that information disseminated throughout a longer period of time and more readily available, not just for formal scheduled meetings? All right, and a limit of additional outside board commitments. So ask the board, are there a limited number of other boards that these particular board members can sit on? Huge topic and issue that came up under the umbrella of COVID. And many board directors just simply could not dedicate the proper amount of time to all the boards they were sitting on. And they basically become useless, or they're effectively useless to all the boards they're on if they can't dedicate the proper amount of time to each one of them. So perfect areas to look at as you probe further into your checklist of areas of importance as a candidate for a board that may be courting you. All right. Shouldn't be any surprise that communication is the key for a successful board. Understand that board members are mindful of one another. Typically, this can be seen in how they communicate. Is there emotion clouding otherwise sound decision making? Do you witness empathy between board members? Hopefully, as a candidate, you're getting to meet more than just one or two board members. I'm a believer that you want to try to meet with as many board members, if not all of them, individually, if possible. All right, so just some other areas of focus here to think about. And you can decipher a lot when observing the interaction and communication style of a board by its individual members. The most successful boards are extremely open to discuss and hear all viewpoints without becoming paralyzed at decision time. This is something I pulled from a previous webinar, but I want to reiterate its importance. And we call this respectful dissent. And it's another great way of understanding and asking the question about how board members, existing board members, deal with differences of opinion, especially when it comes to time for a vote, right? How do they deal with that? And I like to think of this as the phrase of respectful dissent. It's one of the most indicative qualities to observe in a highly functioning board. And a common example of this is if a board member is outvoted on a voiced preference, is that board member still able to say when they left the room that they, or I should say even before they left the room, that they disagree, but they stand by the majority vote of this board and they support the decision 100%. That's an example of respectful dissent. There's no ongoing emotion or drama that comes from this. That board member is not leaving the boardroom telling everybody else that they were the only person against it. Remember, it's a team, and that team goes everywhere together in terms of their decision making. Very important to understand if the board is behaving in this way. And I think this is a very viable question to ask individual board members as you go through your decisioning process and your checklist. All right, I know we're buzzing through this, but we got a lot of content to cover here. So strategy and governance, again, shouldn't be a surprise to those that know me. The effectiveness and efficiency of a board has a direct correlation to the understanding and application of strategy and governance. And I will tell you that some of the direct questions I like to either ask or see asked by or hear by candidates is, ask the question directly. How does the board view its role as it pertains to strategy? Now, most boards are so stuck in this mindset that they're solely there for governance. They've forgotten the fact that you can't govern something if you don't understand the strategy. And not just understand the strategy, but be an expert in the strategy of that organization and understand the risks to the success of that strategy. So, and there's also links obviously to the goals and the goal setting for the organization here as that links to strategy. But I love to get the answer back on this, or hear the answer back on this from the board, and look for, you should be looking for as part of your checklist, so you can put that check in the box for this one, is there a deep understanding of the interrelationship between strategy and governance? Because again, governance does not work without the full understanding of strategy. Another question, has the board linked the organization's goals and strategy to its governance focus and approach? I was just touching on this a moment ago. Try to get a feel for if that board understands how this works, and then examples of how they do this as part of their governance model. And then also looking, as a more recent and relevant question, has the COVID-19 pandemic changed or refocused the board's efforts? Now, when this comes to strategy and to governance, this is extremely important to understand, because many boards, they were not prepared for this level of change. And some examples of this, right? Some boards became not just strategic support for their CEOs, but they actually became an emotional support arm for their CEOs. It's extremely stressful times for CEOs over the past year and a half, and boards had to shift gears a little bit, somewhat, to be that support arm for those CEOs and help them, prop them up, and make sure that they themselves are in a great mental state. Right, time allocations has an area right now or component into COVID-19. The time commitment for boards had drastically increased over this time frame, and it's likely that some of that will stick around into post-COVID times. Transparency, another big one is risk and scenario planning. Right, most boards, they should be doing risk and scenario planning, but it never quite made the agenda, or it was in the last 10 minutes and they talked for a few minutes about it and moved on and adjourned the meeting. COVID-19 totally changed this. It's changed even the expectations and the skill sets that are needed in boardrooms, so that risk and scenario planning has been extremely important skill sets for the board. So look to see, as part of your questioning and your checklist, to see what that board proactively did in that scenario to change, to follow the times, and also give the proper support to the organization. There's multiple types of areas of discussion this can drive the conversation to. Quite important. All right. the simple diagram that took me years to think about. So as I mentioned, all too often, entire boards can lack true understanding of strategy. And remember that great board directors and great boards must be knowledgeable and skilled in both governance and strategy. You can't govern the components of a robust strategy if you don't know exactly what the strategy is. So looking at this even more deeply, if we kind of do an overlay of this and the importance of this, especially in today's world, in this COVID and post-COVID realm we're moving into, it's extremely important for you as a candidate, and especially the board, to understand where strategy exactly sits. So strategy, remember, is situated in between the goals of the organization and the tasks on the other side. And the governance components and what you're responsible for as a board director is for goals to set and ensure relevance, and for the strategy to validate the approach. Now, it's extremely interesting when a board candidate goes into an interview and ask questions around how does the board integrate its strategy and its goals, or how does the board integrate its strategy with its governance. And I can tell you, if the board or the board director that is interviewing you could not answer this question, you're probably pretty much on the no side of the scale of whether or not you want to join that board, because it tells me immediately that they have nowhere near the effectiveness and the efficiency that they should have, and they're likely talking about all the wrong things in their board meetings. So remember, if there's one thing you take away from today's discussion, it's definitely in the strategy area. This tells you a significant amount of what you need to know of whether or not that board is going to be a successful fit for you, and the level of risk they're willing to take in their operations. A few other outlets to drill down on this. There's an article link here, why do boards continue to struggle with strategy. And also on the webinar page on the website, there's a whole webinar, an hour dedicated to this topic of strategy in the board space. Now, if we look at really where that strategy and governance component fits, another great example of how to think about this. So board being in the blue circles and the CEO and possibly management being in the green squares. So think about all the way to the left, the board is responsible for setting the values, vision, mission, and goals of the organization, and then of course governing those. But when we talk about the board directed involvement, there are touch points, or there should be touch points in the processes of the board to the organization for the operations, for proposing new ideas, and for the development of the strategy. Now, I'm not saying that boards should pierce their noses in, fingers out mantra for what their responsibilities are, but I do think based on what a board's responsibilities are, they should never separate themselves from this 100%. And only and solely rely on the CEO for these particular areas or responsibilities. The board needs to have direct transparency points into operations, into the proposal of new ideas, and of course, as I'm mentioning now, into this development of the strategy. Because again, why? A board cannot govern properly if it does not understand the strategy, both the on paper strategy as well as the actual strategy that's being implemented throughout the organization. Another important diagram to reference back to. Okay, processes and board structure. So shouldn't be a surprise again that I'm talking about board structure, right? As the board architect, or my focus in architecture, just know that a board's processes as well as structure, or the architecture, has much to do with its current and future effectiveness, efficiency, and success. I will tell you that years ago, it wasn't by chance that I focused some years of my career in the board architecture area, because it was such an area, or many of the problems that boards experience emanate from the wrong architecture or the wrong structure. I used to joke and say that my role as a board advisor and a board consultant was Groundhog Day, because a lot of these engagements were exactly the same. They were focused on fixing symptoms, but it was obviously pointing back to the architecture or the structure of the board being wrong. And I'm going to touch on a few of these components of things to ask to drill down into as a board candidate, drill down into these boards to see if they are on the same page as you, and if they're of the same level of you in terms of how they're structured. So number one, were you issued a board pitch book? A pitch book is something that shows the fundamentals of the board, how it's structured, what they're about, the values, how they've aligned themselves to values-based decisioning, where you fit as an incoming or potential incoming board director. You'll see an article here at the bottom when you receive this presentation where you can read more about that. Super important to read something or receive something that shows that board has thought this through. They know exactly where you're going to fit. They know where they fit. It shows everything about the operations area of the structure and the components of that particular board. Does the board have an onboarding and assimilation process, right? Are you assigned what's called a board buddy when you start, right? The percentage of failed executives and board directors, truly failed board directors, within their first 6 months to a year is huge. And some studies actually show that at 40 to 60% when they're evaluated on some core materials or core focus areas to see if they're successful or not. So understand that this onboarding and assimilation process is extremely important. Find out if they do this. The board members review or board member reviews performed, right? And not just performed, but are they acted upon? So I can tell you many boards do board reviews of each individual director. The results come out and then those reports kind of disappear into some hole somewhere and never looked at again. So it's not just important to know that the board is reviewed or each member is reviewed, but also how are those actioned upon? And is there some sort of ongoing education for areas that are viewed as lacking? What is the yearly meeting schedule? Seems very superficial, but I can tell you that always having a year look ahead, meaning from today forward. So the next board meeting, you already know a year out what that year out board meeting date is going to be. You have to be present to be effective. You have to be present to be efficient. These are super important to make sure that team is present, especially when you're looking at a properly architected board. Everybody on that board matters. Everybody on that board has something to contribute to a decision. Is there agreed amount of board member time commitments? This again may seem like a very superficial question, but I've seen candidates go through a process and they ask this question and one board director tells them a totally different commitment of time versus another board director. This is the seed or the seeds for animosity on a board. When one board director thinks they're going to put in 100 hours that year and the other director or another director knows that you can't be successful putting in less than 200 hours a year. And I will tell you that I've never seen a successful board director put in less than 200 hours a year on a board. So if you start getting answers back on this where there is no documented commitment, it's not been discussed, you start to get disparate answers where one person says 50 hours and the other person says 300, you know already that that board is misaligned. And you know already also that you have people that are the heroes on the board that do probably a majority of the work. And you have others that join simply to give their opinion on what the heroes have done during a board meeting, not where you want to be. How is the board structured? We're going to talk about that in a moment. I like to say, what is the architecture of that board? Again, extremely important. How often are the bylaws reviewed? Kind of an interesting question to ask. It may seem very, again, high level or superficial, but it's important to know that that board is actually behaving in a way that their bylaws call out. And if they're not, are they updated? Many boards go through a process every few years of doing updates to their bylaws to make sure that they're current. It also is a way to attract great directors because the directors are going to ask for a copy of the bylaws. If they look like they were written in 1865, I can tell you the risk of that board is greatly increased. Additional near-term board change is expected. So another quite interesting question to ask, but remember, a lot of times when a board is looking for a new board member, they also have other changes they are proposing. You want to know about those changes before you become a board member and understand why they're making those changes. And is it specifically listed in their goals? Is it part of their strategy? Can you get a copy of the strategy that supports those changes? You don't want to join an organization that's been successful for a while. And now they're going to make extreme changes without understanding how it integrates in with their strategy, their goals, and how it's going to be governed properly. So some areas to think about when we talk about as part of the checklist, areas to look at for your processes in the structure. And if I go a little bit deeper into this, quick overview on this. Again, if you want more detail, you can get this. Think about a board as being structured properly in 3 areas. The vertical considerations, which we call your sphere of influence. This is the areas of expertise of a board. Horizontal considerations. This is called your planes of congruence. This builds the board's character. There are a lot of boards out there that have a great sphere of influence, but have no planes of congruence, which means they have absolutely no character. Think about sitting with that team and working with them right now. All the same personality types in some cases, all the same background, all the same experiences. You want to try to get some horizontal diversity on that particular team in many areas. Could be different areas of diversity, including personality types, skill set areas, depth of knowledge in areas above and beyond their sphere of influence. And then looking one step further of what we call your coverage and balance, which really creates the board's depth. This allows for things to really take shape in a board. It allows for proper debates in knowledge areas, proper debates in planes of congruence areas, and looking at things from multiple different viewpoints. This comes back to that diversity of perspective and having the ability to have in-depth conversations within the boardroom for decisions. I think we probably talked a little bit about this, but I think for you, what you're really looking for is you're probably going to get answers back if you ask the question about how is the board structured. You're likely going to get answers back about committees, which is fine. Understand what committees those boards have. You should probably go to an interview understanding how the board is structured from a committee area, but know when you ask the question, you're probably going to get answers back that are committee structure related. And maybe areas of influence, as we say here in the sphere of influence. What you're likely not going to get back answers on, or it's going to seem disparate and disjointed, is this planes of congruence and this coverage and balance area we just spoke of. Know that you want to probe a little bit in this area to understand if the board is a whole team of mini-me's, right, where they're all alike and they're all thinking exactly the same way, or is there an understanding of the importance of the diversity across that board to understand that they are having debates and deliberations that actually mean something because they're coming from a diversity of perspectives. Again, more detail on that you can see in my book if you're interested. All right, and then let's end with the topic of remuneration, or really what we call compensation and protection. And understanding board director compensation is not only about knowing how much you will be paid, but more so understanding if the board is keeping up with changing pay models and incentives. Let that sink in for a moment, because regardless, even if a board is on the higher scale of pay, but that pay is not in a modern concept of how to incentivize the right actions of that board. Prime example of this being a balance between some sort of equity payment or some sort of performance-based incentive in the organization being around 50%, and the other 50% being a cash retainer amount, right? That's best practice today, right? And a board that does that, you kind of know that they've been not only keeping up with best practices, but they're also incentivizing in many cases in the right areas. Now, a board that's incentivized, that's all incentivized on a cash retainer, is that driving some of the right behaviors in that particular organization and within the board? It's almost as if the performance doesn't matter at all for how they're compensated, so why would they pay more attention to performance in the organization? So commonly, boards employing older compensation models are also lacking in numerous other important areas of modern board operations. This is a great question. It's almost a litmus test for many in asking this question to see what is the initial response and answer you get back from the board, right, or the nominating committee when you ask this question. They're going to think it's a very high level question, but you're looking for a deeper meaning to this by the answer you get back on it. Now, I would also say at the bottom, as I mentioned here, it's recommended in most cases to ask compensation and insurance questions outside of a formal interview environment, unless it's brought up by the evaluator or the person running those interviews. But know that you still want to have this on your checklist. The proper process for these interviews and the interaction as a board candidate should include some offline time, not just all offline time with board members, not just solely interview type formal interactions. But this is another very telling question, and again, a litmus test for understanding if that board is keeping current with practices. Okay, so a few questions to ask here more formally on this particular page. What is the board's compensation model, and is it in line with modern board director compensation trending? We just went through that. Is there a yearly review of the boards, and this is switching gears now to the protection, right? Is there a yearly review of the board's indemnification policies as well as the D&O insurance, right? So understanding this, and we're going to talk in a moment, that this question is not just a personal question of protecting yourself, but it's also understanding is the board protected as a whole, and to what lengths has the organization gone to, and how does it value its officers and its executives in the organization. And another area of importance, I think I like to see this question asked, or I'll ask this question, is does the board offer, or do other directors carry their own IDL or independent director liability insurance? And just to show this visually of how this works, again, there's a whole nother webinar if you want to watch an hour on D&O insurance that I did with colleague and friend of mine on the topic. And we touched on these three areas to fully understand the depth of coverage for your protection. But know that when we talk about indemnification, D&O, and IDL, there truly is an order to this. Most people believe that protections are in parallel, meaning that indemnification and D&O kind of hit at the same time and they protect you, but that's actually not the case. They're more serial. So the corporate indemnification, either through the board's bylaws, which the bell should go off from what I mentioned a moment ago about the yearly review of the bylaws of the organization or the articles of incorporation, right? Important to look at those to make sure that the indemnification is correct and modernized for protections in today's world of directors and officers. And then if the indemnification is not enough to cover you, then the D&O insurance kicks in. Biggest concept here to remember is that they are serial, number one, and number two, they are directly interlinked. The D&O insurance should be compared to the indemnification insurance to make sure there are no gaps between those two. And there are instances, numerous instances, where corporate indemnification was not technically covering an instance or a breach within that board, and the D&O insurance didn't specifically call it out. So that director was left high and dry because they were not covered for that specific instance. Another prime example of making sure the bylaws are reviewed properly, also in how they're integrated with the D&O insurance. Now, the other thing here, and not to go into too much detail, but the IDL, or the Independent Director Liability Insurance, many directors are not aware this is available to them. This can be purchased either for you as an individual. It can be purchased by a board for each of its individual directors. And you can also purchase it for yourself to cover you for multiple boards you may sit on. It's a great way of offering up another level of coverage should the indemnification and the D&O insurance not kick in. I like to see the question asked and ask the question of, do any other directors have IDL insurance? Because I want to understand the level of knowledge of other directors in how they understand their risk in serving on a board. Do they understand that above and beyond indemnification and D&O, are they even aware of the fact that IDL insurance exists? It again is a way of showing the depth of knowledge of not just that person's sphere of influence or industry vertical knowledge, but also are they viewing board directorship as a discipline? Are they truly skilled in knowledge areas of board directorship? And this can lead to some extremely interesting discussions as part of the process. Something to keep in mind. All right. So I think we're pretty good on time here to allow some time for questions too. So let me go through the summary, and if you have questions, please start to write them into the Q&A section. But for our summary first, know that there are undoubtedly additional questions you will have for a board when counter-vetting. Remember that term of counter-vetting. It's not just that you're asking questions, you are doing your own research. You're doing your own investigative work to make sure you're piercing all the niceties that sit at the top of an interview and make sure you're getting down to what's important to you and to the organization and to board directors as a whole. You want to have a decisive plan of specific questions, right? So you want to be able to fully understand and directly weigh in on your decisioning process of whether or not you should join a board. It's not just about the board deciding if you're a right fit. Again, it's about you deciding if that board is a right fit for you also. Important questions, such as those mentioned earlier, they should lead to a weighted list of must-haves in your decisioning process. So know that, I don't know if we can say there's a quantitative scale here that says, well, they're missing this particular XYZ area, but they have ABC, and altogether that falls on a scale where it's still acceptable for me to join. What I want you to be mainly aware of in this is that you should be thinking of this as your tolerance for risk in joining that particular board. Yes, there are components of enjoying what you do and being part of a team and making an impact. I get all that. But you have to also think about this from the other side of saying, there are areas that are great that I like about this potential board that I'm going to join, but there are also areas that could be showstoppers for me, and that should specifically drive questions deeper and deeper into those areas as part of your counter-vetting process. But know that you're weighing this on a list or a scale on the back end to see if this is truly things that you can live with and things that are acceptable to you. Don't let the flattery of being asked to join a board cloak important decisioning points when evaluating if a board is right for you. Just talked about this a moment ago, right? So many people are so quick to answer yes the minute that the position's been offered to them, and they're not listening to their gut sometimes of saying, you know, there's an area here that I'm not quite sure about, but they believe they're going to work that out over the next 6 months. I can tell you that that's not a successful formula for you to think of or a process for you, you want to have these answers weighing into your yes or no in advance of you joining that particular board. You will likely find, as many do, that a high percentage of boards will simply not be a great fit for you, and this is okay. Don't be afraid to say no. Simply remain discerning and always look for the correct fit. I have friends of mine that are laughing at me right now. I think in the last 20 months, I've turned down 9 board seat offers, a few of them public companies. And the reason for it is that I just didn't feel like they were a right fit. It wasn't just about saying yes because you could make good money doing these things. There's time commitments to these, of course, but I didn't feel like they were an exact fit based on how they had architected their boards, as an example, right? I don't want to join a people that are all just like me. I want to join people that are different than me, so we all come together and come to much different conclusions and much better conclusions. That to me is a successful decision that should come out of your board checklist. And don't be fearful of showing up. I had someone mention to me once that, oh, well, I don't want to show up with a notebook with a list of questions. I'll tell you right now, I actually appreciate those people when they show up. There's nothing wrong with being prepared. Make sure they are valid questions. Simply don't ask questions that you already can get the answers to on their website or by looking, if it's a public company, at their proxy statements or their annual statements, right? Ask questions that you've already vetted and looked at and done your own research on. There may still be questions in those areas, but make sure you're not just being viewed as someone who's showing up to ask open-ended questions. You want to make sure you spend your time, and a significant amount of time and preparation to join a board interview and be impactful. All right. So I'm just going to do a quick time check. I welcome you to visit our website, specifically if you're interested more in this packaging yourself properly. We have a pretty robust program, I'll say, in this education and certification area, and it's a global certification that comes from that. Let's move to questions. All right, hang on one second. I'm going to launch my question area here. I see there's a few in the chat here as well. All right, let's start out. How do you measure what's acceptable and what's not? Yeah, and I mentioned this a moment ago. The point of this exercise is to create your own evaluation scale. It's not going to give you 100% of the answers, but I believe you'll know from your feeling about it if there's areas where you feel you're just not getting the right answer, or they're pointing to a dysfunctional team. That's when you're getting to the point of defining your risk tolerance on this. And we've all worked with teams where they just were not structured properly, or they had the wrong personality types, or they didn't have a balance of personality types. It's just not where you want to be, and the risk, again, to you as a board director is too much to actually chance that. So does this information apply to any board, meaning also nonprofits and non-paid board seats? I will tell you the answer is yes. And I do not differentiate between the commitments and the questions that you ask to see if a board is right for you. I'll give you a few examples of this at a high level. And I appreciate this question. So nonprofits, I will tell you, if you sit on a nonprofit board, make no mistake, you have the same level of legal liability as a private and a public company. If a nonprofit organization is sued, they're going to name the board directors of the nonprofit. And if that nonprofit does not have D&O insurance or indemnification, you are paying for your protection now and your attorney out of your pocket, period. Most people don't know that. It's exactly how it works. Most people are caught off guard. A private company board, right? The concepts we're talking about here, asking about if they're spending time to structure the board properly. Whether it's a public, private, or nonprofit organization, for you to be 100% successful and know you're joining a low-risk board, their structure of how they've gone about looking at the architecture of that board matters. It's also going to play into your level of happiness and serving on that board, quite frankly. So know that these concepts I view as universal, and you should be asking questions. Now, there are areas where there's going to be regulations and compliance. I understand for public companies, there's some areas of private companies for that. Even nonprofits have their own areas of compliance for transparency and financial reporting, right? But taking those aside, knowing there are some nuances and differences between the entity types for nonprofit, private, and public, as a board director, you should enter any of those entity types with the same understanding as you would for being a disciplined board director. You're making a commitment. Prime failure point on nonprofit boards is that people join without understanding their time commitment. I'll say it again. I've never seen a nonprofit board be successful without each board member dedicating a minimum of 200 hours a year, period. Doesn't happen, doesn't work. Okay. Let me see the other question here. Okay, so I agree with the balance points. It says, wonder how to approach an interview where the directors don't ask many questions of the candidate, but simply say, I've heard nice things about you. Do you have any questions? I have found this happens later in the process after board leadership has interviewed the candidate. Any advice on how to handle? So I will tell you that to me, it's obviously easier to, and I hope I'm answering this question, your question properly. I find it easier to guide the conversation on topics that you want to make relevant points for by you being given the floor to answer, right? And I hope this is your question here. So prime example of this is that many boards will not ask the question, or I'll say nominating committees or board members that are hosting or performing interviews will not ask of a board candidate things relating to their values-based decisioning process or their understanding. I'll give you a quick secret question I ask in the first 5 minutes when I'm working with a nominating committee and building out their processes. The question is the following: what is your understanding of the interrelationship between strategy and governance? And I can tell you with that question immediately, if it's not answered properly, the interview is over. So I would tell you, looking from the other side of the candidate, from the outside looking in, I would tell you again, as part of your checklist, if you're given the floor and the interviewer simply says, I've heard nice things about you, do you have any questions? That's a prime opportunity for you to go into making a statement first, such as, I'm a values-based decision maker and how I lead. Can you tell me a little bit about how your particular board makes decisions? Perfect way for you to actually propose a question back that makes sense and is valid for you getting information you need and showing that it's important to you, right? Questions around, as I mentioned, the strategy and governance component. How active are you with the CEO in setting the goals of the organization? Perfect question to ask, right? And then the follow-up question to that could be, how actively involved is the board in the strategy creation? There's not necessarily a right or wrong answer to this, but it shows through your experience that you're asking questions that matter to how a board operates. And of course, governance questions, right? What type of processes, how does the board govern itself through its committees? Another great question to ask, right? Meaning, are the committees supplying status reports as part of the board book prior to a formal board meeting? So again, if you can help to drive the narrative through a statement followed by a question, to me, it's one of the most successful ways of creating that camaraderie where you're both, as we said earlier, you're the defense and the offense all in one, but you become the controller of the process and the controller of the type of topics that you're talking about. All right, let's see what else. Yep, I would agree. Not-for-profits, private company as well as private, agree. Absolutely. I like to make my webinars more at the universal principle level rather than for specific industries or specific entity types, such as only or solely nonprofit, private, or public. Another comment here, a question. I haven't seen strategy so clearly defined as you have shown. Thank you. I won't admit how many years it took me to get to that, but it's been very helpful. Are most boards aware of this? So I would tell you that most boards, and I did an article on this, and I think there's a link to it from this presentation when you get it. And it says, why do boards continue to struggle with strategy? I believe it's because many board directors have been out of the loop for a long time when it comes to actually being involved in the creation and the implementation of a strategy in support of goals. Probably a pretty lofty comment to make, but I believe that's probably the source of why there's some issues in that area. Again, I think the importance of that strategy being integrated into that environment and making sure the board understands where that fits, and even have an understanding of how they're working with the organization, either in the governance or the creation of that strategy, if indeed they're going to take it to that level of being involved in it, I think is extremely important. So thank you for your comment and question on that. All right, I think we have time for one last question. That bell is telling me we've got about a minute and a half left. What is the most common time in advance of a board meeting that a board book should be sent out? Good question. I like to see it no less than a week. Now, some boards in the past have aimed for longer than a week. I can tell you that I'm not a fan of that because I don't want the information to be stale by the time the board comes to meet a week later, or in this case, if they get it out 2 weeks in advance. But you as a board candidate or even a board director, you really shouldn't ask for much less or have in your process much less than a week or 7 full days of review. I can tell you the most meaningful board meetings happen when that information goes out a week in advance. And the least meaningful board meetings happen when that material goes out less than 4 days in advance. And that's when the board meeting becomes more of an update meeting than a strategic meeting and a governance type meeting. So usually about a week is what I like to see on that. All right. I think we're right around the time now. Let me see if there's any other questions. All right. I appreciate everybody joining today. I hope you got out of this what you planned on by joining. And as mentioned, in a day or two, you'll get a copy of a link in your email to the website where you'll see the video if you want to watch that, or just specifically want to download this presentation deck. It's yours. All right. Thank you once again. Take a look for our next webinar, either be next month or the following month. That'll be on that page as well, that we'll link out to. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day. Bye now.